Hey, everybody. Welcome to coaching, Wednesday afternoon coaching. I have started a series several weeks ago. I guess this is week 4. So we've been talking about being on mission with him and some different aspects of that, including seeing yourself as a missionary to your city, going where he sends you. And then last week we talked about access ministry, had some really I really enjoyed that because I got to hear what people are doing and just some really wonderful ways God is leading people and some really great results that people are getting as a result of it. And like someone said at prayer the other day, it looks like I need to buy some trash bags. So, hey, if you don't know what that means, you should listen to the last session we did on access ministry, learn how to find persons of peace using a trash bag. So that's quite a ministry. But anyway, so today before we move into that, I just want to kind of close out what we talked about with access ministry, which will lead into what we're going to talk about today. And it's a quote from lesson 5 in our training, and you'll probably remember this, but maybe you won't, but back in lesson 5, when we were trained, we came across this. And it says, around the world, the number one way that DMMers find those interested in God is by serving them. And then in parentheses, healing prayer, kind deed, community service. So by serving them while consistently, simultaneously, and culturally appropriately, it's a lot of leaves, pointing to God. So we are serving them through healing prayer, kind deed, and community service. And so I want you to keep that in mind as we go through. That's the number one way that that we find persons of peace, people that are spiritually open, people that are spiritually interested. So now today is going to be a little different than what we did the last 3 weeks, because it's not going to be so much about information or content, but today is basically going to be a challenge. And so that's what this is about today, is a challenge to all of us, not just to you, but to all of us. And so get ready to be challenged. But when I was in San Diego last month, as a number of us were for our eLife gathering, we had dinner. My husband and I, Matt, had dinner with Stan Parks. And I think most of y'all know Stan. He's been on this call several times. At least most of us know him because he's featured prominently in Chris's book, From Megachurch to Multiplication, because he's the guy that has been coaching the eLife guys and leaders of eLife as they've gone through this process of transitioning and relaunching as a group of a family of churches, which has really led to us being here. Stan also was one of the writers of the curriculum that we all were trained with. And Stan himself is a movement catalyst, and he works with movements. He lives overseas now, and he works with movements, some of the biggest movements we know of. He works with them. He's been face to face with the leaders and the people. He's very involved in all of that. So as far as anybody I personally know, Stan knows more about movements firsthand than anybody that I personally know. Maybe you know somebody, but for me, when he talks about movements, I want to listen to what he's got to say, because I'm a movement catalyst, and that's how God's working through me and in my life, and I'm interested in learning more. So when we had dinner with him, one of the things that I asked him something, but recognized that when we had dinner with him, we had just spent 2.5 days of sitting in a room, literally sitting in a circle in a room, listening to people share what they've been doing, how they got into this journey of DMM. They were talking about the experiences they've had, what's keeping them keeping them on track, why they're still here, why they haven't quit. And then also people sharing what God had given them to bring to the group. So people were sharing testimonies and scriptures and principles, and one guy shared songs. I mean, there were a lot of things being shared, but during that 2.5 days, including a lot of time downtime where we were just talking to people one-on-one, and Stan was doing that. He was there with us the whole time. And during that time, he'd had a lot of opportunity to talk to us and to hear at least those who were gathered in San Diego, what we're doing, where we are as a network, as a family of, disciple makers, where we are. And so I asked him when we were there, I said, Stan, from your viewpoint and from your experience as a movement catalyst and a coach to movements, what is it that we need to do as a network, as a family of disciple makers? We're hoping to see movements. What is it that we need to do next? Or what, maybe what gaps are there in what we're doing here? And so I asked him, and I didn't know, how he was going to respond, but he had an answer for me very quickly. So I knew it was something he had been thinking about himself. And this is what he said. I want to share it with you. He said this. He said that it seems to me that as I've been hearing y'all talk, and as I've been familiar with what you're doing, that it seems about 90% of the encounters that y'all are having with people as you go out among the lost, as you're out, looking to connect with people and have spiritual conversations. He said it seems that about 90% of those encounters that you're having with people are truth encounters. That's what he called it, truth encounters. I'd never heard that term before, but when he said it, I'm like, yeah, I get the gist of what you're saying. And then he said this, maybe 10% are power encounters. Now, when he said that, I think he was being generous with us, because I would say probably less than 10% are actually power encounters. And by power encounters, he was talking about healings and miracles. So when he's talking about truth encounters, he's talking about sharing the scripture with people, sharing, stories from the scripture, those kinds of things, the truth. And then the power encounters, he's talking about supernatural power. He's talking about God's power coming on the scene, and particularly like how we would understand it would be mainly like healing and miracles. There's some other kinds of power encounters as well we see in the scripture, but just think of it in those terms. And so then he went on to share kind of like to convince me. He shared that in his own personal study of the Gospels and Acts, that it seems like the encounters that they had as they went out seemed to be about 50% truth encounters and then 50% power encounters. Now, to be honest with you, I haven't reread the Gospels and Acts since he said that to me, but I can definitely verify that in the Gospels and in Acts, they had many healings and miracles that, when you look at the ministry of Jesus, you look at the disciples, you look at what they did in the book of Acts, we definitely see power encounters and we see God's power. And so Stan said that we need a lot more power encounters if we're going to see movement. And then he related it to what he had seen in movements that are happening, overseas that are growing, that there's a lot of power encounters. So that was challenging to me. I'll get back to that in a minute. I want to go through some discovery a little bit before we close up with the challenge. But that was the opening. Now, since Stan said that to me, it's been over a month now since he said that to me. And so I've just been considering what he said. I've been praying about it. I've been thinking about it. And I've also been talking to various people. And so I just want to share from that a little bit with you about this challenge that Stan said to me, that was evoked by my question. So why don't we do a little discovery first? And so what I'm going to do is ask Chris if he would just unmute everybody. And I'm going to have a couple of scriptures, just a couple that I'm going to ask someone to read. So if you have a Bible nearby and can read, are willing to read, we're going to go to Matthew chapter 11. And if somebody can find that, and if you should be able to unmute. If someone can, I can't see everybody because of the way the screen is right now. So if somebody can find that and tell me they can read, I would appreciate it. Who can read that? Just unmute and tell me. I'm going to read it.
I can read it.
Okay, well, hold on just a minute before you do. All right, and so we see there, we're going to read verses 4 and 5, but in Matthew 11, it's the account where you probably remember this. John the Baptist was in prison, and he was contemplating what was going on, what was happening, and he sent 2 of his disciples over to Jesus, and he said, go and ask him, is he the coming one, or should we be looking for another? And, I guess he's saying, are you the Messiah? Are you the coming one, the one we've heard about, or should we be looking for another? And so then they came to Jesus with that, question. We're here from John, and this is our question. And so that's what the framing of these two verses is in Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 and 5. So if you could read that now, go ahead.
This is from ESV. And Jesus answered them, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them."
Yes, thank you. Now, let me ask you a question. What does this tell us? As you read that to us, as you look back over these verses, what does this tell us about the kind of encounters that Jesus was having with people?
Healings and miracle encounters.
Mostly.
You see healing and miracles. What else do you see?
There's a truth encounter as well.
There's a truth encounter as well. Exactly. So when we look at this verse, so Jesus himself is explaining his own ministry. That's what I love about this verse. It's Jesus explaining his own ministry, not someone looking at it, but him giving his own explanation of what's going on. And he told them, go tell John the things you hear and see. So there was something in his ministry to hear. There was something in his ministry to see. And so he tells us what people could see. They could see the blind seeing, the lame walking, lepers being cleansed, deaf hearing, and dead being raised. And they also could hear, what could they hear? The truth, the gospel being preached to them. So we see that Jesus was having truth encounters by the gospel. He preached the gospel. He certainly had a lot of truth encounters. You read the red words in my Bible, the red words in the gospels. There was a lot of truth Jesus was given to people he encountered, but there's also a lot of accounts of power coming through him and being ministered to people. And these are some of the examples he's giving them, some, big highlights: blind, lame, lepers, deaf, even the dead being raised. So we see truth and power. We don't just see truth, we see truth and power. So then let's go to Luke 5. If someone would go to Luke chapter 5 for me. And while you're turning there to Luke 5, this is the account. I'll just quickly take you through Luke 5. The first part of Luke 5 is where Peter, went out fishing. Jesus used Peter's boat. Then Jesus told Peter, cast down your nets for a catch. Peter did that. Then Peter left on following Jesus. And then immediately following that in Luke 5, we don't know what the time lapse, but as far as what Luke recorded, we see Jesus healed a leper. And then he told this leper not to tell anybody, but just to go and show himself to the priest. And so who has Luke chapter 5, verse 15? I want someone to read that, just that verse, Luke chapter 5, 15, because this is the explanation of what happened as a result of this miracle that Jesus did in this leper's life. So who has Luke 5:15 that is willing to read for us? Go ahead.
I've got it.
Go ahead. Thank you, Grace.
Okay.
You go ahead.
Yet the news about him spread all the more, so that crowds of people came to hear him and to be healed of their sicknesses.
Okay. So let me ask you, Grace, what were people hoping to encounter when they came to Jesus? So they came to Jesus. What was it they were coming to get or to encounter?
Healing.
Healing? Anything else?
And to hear him.
To hear him. Exactly. They were coming. Maybe some people came to hear him. Maybe some people came to be healed. Maybe all of them came to hear him be healed. It doesn't just to differentiate that much, but it says great multitudes came to hear and to be healed by him of their infirmities. It was both. It wasn't either or. So they came to hear and to be healed, to hear the truth and to receive his healing power. And so what we see from this is that in the ministry of Jesus, truth and power both had a prominent place. And I, according to Stan, truth and power. And I think if we keep reading our Bibles, we'd see truth and power both have a prominent place in disciple making. And then if you follow the ministry of Jesus and see how he interacted with people, we see that with some people, he led with truth. That's what they needed. That's what they came for. That's what they needed. And then with other people, he led with power. He always gave them the truth, but he seems to have led with power. And then his followers, they seem to follow this same pattern. If you keep reading, and there's a lot we could get into, but I just want you to sort of follow along in your thinking now into the book of Acts, and we'll just kind of talk about a couple of things there. The first thing we see as far as ministry among the lost in the book of Acts is we see in Acts chapter 2, the day of Pentecost. Well, the day of Pentecost dawned with a great outpouring of power. And you can read about that, but it was an outpouring of the Spirit. So there was power. But then what happened when that power came and all this stuff happened, people were hearing these languages and people were that was happening there. Peter stood up and he started preaching. What was that? That was truth. So there was this power that happened, but the power needs the truth. And so there was power, but then Peter got up and started bringing forth the truth. So the power got the people's attention or drew them together. And Peter was able to preach. So we see that. Now, if you follow along what's going on and watch them, so to speak, you get to Acts 3 when Peter and John go up to the temple and at the hour of prayer, and they're going up and they're going through the gate that was called Beautiful. And there was a guy there who had been lame from his mother's womb, and he's laying there. And when Peter saw him, what we see is there was a healing. This guy was healed. There was a miracle. This guy had over 40 years. We find, if we keep reading, that this guy had been lame, and he laid there and they knew him, and they knew it was this guy who was healed. And it caused like a big stir. People were really stirred up. Again, there was this stirring from this power encounter this guy had. But what happened, if you keep reading, you see Peter gave the truth. He got up and started sharing the truth, the gospel. And so there was the power, but then we see the truth. Now in Acts 4:4, I'll just read that to you. Acts 4:4, it says, many of those who heard the word believed, and the number of men came to be about 5,000. Now, that was explosive growth we see in those first few chapters of Acts. We see explosive growth, and we see a pattern. There's power and there's truth. There's power and there's truth. And so it wasn't just power of no truth, but it also wasn't just truth with no power. There was both. So that power and truth were connected. Now, if somebody can get their Bible open to Luke chapter 10, and I want to tie us and the strategy we've been following into this. Luke chapter 10, somebody can turn there. We're going to read. If you want to turn to Luke chapter 10, this is the account of where Jesus is given instructions about his strategy to the 72 or the 70, depending on your translation, and he's sending them out. And so y'all know this, we've studied this. There's a lot in here of practical instruction that he's giving them. But then when he comes down to Luke chapter 10 and verse 9, who can unmute and read that for us? Won't somebody unmute and read Luke 10 verse 9?
It says, heal the sick who are there and tell them the kingdom of God has come near to you.
Okay, Jim, thank you. Now, Jim, what are his instructions here? What do we see here about his instructions about what we are to offer people when we encounter them?
We're to offer them first healing. Well, maybe not even first, but heal them and then also tell them about the kingdom.
Yeah. So what would you say that those two things are, healing and the kingdom has come near you? What in what we've been discussing, what would you say those two represent?
Yeah, a power encounter and a truth encounter.
Yeah. So that's what he's telling them. Yeah. And I don't think it necessarily has to be in that order, or, like you said, I love that you said, yeah, but these are both things that are available for us to do, that we're told to do. Heal the sick and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near you. So there's those two sides, truth encounters and power encounters. It may be power then truth. It may be truth then power. But what I've seen is that the power seems to open the door for the truth, or And in Mark's gospel, the last verses there that at least the King James still has that. Some of the newer versions don't include the final verses of Mark chapter 16, but some of the last verses there say, and when he gave them the instruction about what to do in Mark's gospel, and then it says, and they went out everywhere, and he went with them, confirming the word with signs following. It's this idea that the power was a confirmation to the truth. In other words, the power confirms the truth. The power is a supernatural, spiritual force that confirms the truth that is spoken. Now, to get back a little bit to Stan here that night, I'm sitting there and Stan sharing this with me. I have to tell you, it shook me up. A couple of people came and sat with us. Some of you who are here sat with us. John Bradshaw was with us. Kind of several people were added to us, but just this discussion we were having, it started shaking me up. And the reason why is became very personal to me. So this part, if you'll just indulge me, I want to just share some from why this impacted me the way it did, and maybe this will encourage you. So before we came into disciple making, so we went through the training. This summer will be 4 years ago. Prior to that, we'd been in ministry 24 years. And during that time of we had done a whole lot of evangelism and outreach into neighborhoods and all kinds of ministry in the streets, done a lot of different things. And during that, one of the things that was maybe you could say an earmark of what we were doing was that we always looked for opportunities to minister to the sick and to pray for miracles. That was just something that was very normal for us. And it really just goes back a long way. And just my grandparents were Pentecostals. They got saved in the 1920s, just after the Azusa revival that had happened just not that long before that, a couple decades before. And out of that, eventually, and my grandparents came to faith through that. And so I was raised on both sides of my family. I was raised in this kind of environment where healing and miracles and talk about that and praying for those things was very normal. In fact, one of my memories as a child is I remember being a little girl and being around my great uncle, my granny's brother, Vance. He was an evangelist from the 1920s all the way into the 70s. He was an evangelist, and he was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and it was very serious. And I remember the family praying for him. And in a few minutes, he went to the bathroom. This is gross. He went to the bathroom and he vomited, and he actually threw up. I didn't go look at it, but everybody was looking at it. This really weird black stuff or whatever, y'all, it's just weird. And that was actually, went back to the doctor and all the stomach cancer was gone. And you might say, Suzie, that was gross, but y'all, there were some really gross things that happened in the Bible too. So, but anyway, he was healed. And so, I mean, that kind of marks you when you're a kid, that seems kind of normal in your life. And then when we were in college, Matt and I, John Wimber, who's one of the founders of the Vineyard movement, John Wimber came to our campus for a week, and he did training in what he called power evangelism. That's the first time I ever heard that word or those words together. I learned later that Lonnie Frisbee actually coined that phrase, the guy from the Jesus Revolution, power evangelism, because Lonnie Frisbee worked with Jim Wimber at the early days of the Vineyard. But anyway, John was there, and there were maybe 30 of us, maybe not even, I'm probably being generous, of us that showed up for that training for a week. And we're part of that. And he took us through, scriptures and all kinds of things. And he showed us some practical things. And then he challenged us to go out and minister healing to people. And so we started doing that. And I saw a lot of people get healed. I saw girls in our dorm get healed of a lot of different things just from, acting on what we were seeing in that training. So I just went out and did it and saw a lot of things happening. So during that time, while I was, of course, sharing that, casting vision for that and sharing that and training believers in that, even though I was still in college, and I was home on spring break. And one of my older brothers and me and some of our friends went to Atlanta for a weekend, and we were staying in downtown Atlanta. And one of my brother's friends, Chris, he was a firm agnostic. And he would always say, well, if there is a God, I've never seen him. And it was, my brother would try to witness to him. And, most of us were believers, but he would always say that, well, anytime we'd have any kind of spiritual conversation, he'd be like, well, if there is a God, I've never seen him. So one of the days we were there, Chris, that guy, and my brother, and then one of my girlfriends, Sue, had gone out of the hotel they were going. I don't know what they were doing there, but they were crossing the street right in front of the hotel in downtown Atlanta. And as the light had turned for them to be able to go, Sue, my friend, stepped off the curb into the crosswalk, and there was a cab who was trying to still get through, even though the light was red, and he was running, and he hit her full on right in the middle of the taxi, hit her right in her side. She's going across, and bam, he hits her. And so it hit her and it knocked her up in the air, and she lands down on the street. And so my brother and Chris, who were with him, were behind, and they saw it. It happened right in front of them. Of course, they rushed, right to Sue, and they look over, Chris is the agnostic. Then there's my brother, and they look down, and the first thing they see is her left leg. She was hit like on the left side, and her left leg was broken, and the bone was like, it was like a compound fracture. It was like this. So her leg was no longer like straight. It was like this. And her foot was turned away that feet can't turn, and the bone was pressed up against the skin like this. And it was obviously this, and she can't move it and all that. And she's in terrible, terrible pain, and her leg is dangling there, and this bone is up like that. And it's kind of freaking them out. They're all young, and you haven't seen things like this. And in a moment, my brother, who was also raised in the same family I was raised in, and who I had been talking to about this power evangelism stuff, he just, I don't know why, but he just put his hand over on her, and he just started ministering to her and praying for her. And while he was doing that, Chris was right there with him, the agnostic, and he saw this. He heard my brother praying, he was seeing it, and suddenly right in front of them, the bone shifted into place. It moved, and her leg straightened out. And instead of it being like this, and her foot turned around, and immediately the pain left, and it was gone. Well, about that time, there was somebody called an ambulance, and the ambulance had come, coming in with their sirens whirling. And I happened to be upstairs in the hotel right above that. So when I heard sirens sounded like they were outside, I look out the window and I see my friend Sue on the ground on the street. So what is going on? And I rush down there, and I get out there about the time that Chris has just witnessed this, and he is like freaking out. He was just kind of mumbling, and he was saying, I don't know what that was. I just can't believe what I just saw. I'm not sure what in the world was that. And he was just like beside himself. And so they loaded Sue up in the ambulance, took her to the ER, and you know what? They x-rayed her, and she was totally fine. There was nothing wrong with her. She walked out of there, in a couple of hours. And in fact, 2 weeks later, she got married and walked down the aisle to get married, and was told, praise God. But as a result of what had happened in that moment, Chris was really open. And so before we tried to share with him, he wasn't interested, but now he was real interested. And so we were able to share with him what God had done, and he ended up giving his life to the Lord. And that was 37 years ago. And Chris is still walking with Jesus now. He's a leader, in a church here in our town. Anyway, it was just really cool. But that power encounter opened him up to the truth. He had never been up before, and it opened him up. And then, like I said earlier, when we started a church and we're in ministry now, we continued in that vein. And one of the leaders of a lot of the outreaches we did was that brother that I was telling you about, my older brother, Eddie. And we would take people in outreach, and we'd coach people in ministry and healing like we'd learned to do. And over the course of those years of ministry, we saw the Lord, a lot of people, we saw a lot of things happening. We saw, as a result of a whole lot of healings and miracles and truth encounters, we saw more than 20,000 people make professions of faith. But we didn't understand generational disciple making, so we missed being able to identify the persons of peace for what they were, and to see generational disciple making, which is why I was so excited when I read From Mega Church to Multiplication, because I was like, yes, this is absolutely what should be happening, and this is what we need. And anyway. But during that time also, we had another situation. Our daughter was engaged to be married to her husband, Josh, and Josh had a good friend named Vinny, and Vinny was an atheist. And I don't know what all had happened in Vinny's life. He'd had some really tough things happen, but Josh was a Christian, a strong Christian. And my daughter and Josh, who's now her husband, would try to witness to him, share the gospel with him. He just shut him down. And so anyway, they all lived down in Charleston, and they came up one weekend to visit. And when they came up here, I had met Vinny before, but none of us here knew that Vinny, when he was 15 years old, had a tumor in his ear and had been diagnosed with cancer in that tumor. It had been, and so the doctors had looked at that and they said to him and his parents, look, we have two choices. First of all, we can do chemo, maybe radiation. I know chemo was part of it, and we can treat it, but we're not sure that that will cure it or that it won't come back. Or we could go in and we could take that tumor out. But if we do that, he's going to lose hearing in that ear. But we're pretty confident that if we take it out, he won't have to have any other treatment and that it won't come back. And so his parents let Vinny choose which he wanted, and Vinny chose to have it removed surgically, and he lost his hearing. Well, none of us knew that, but Vinny knew that. And so while he was here, we also had some friends visiting us, and that friend had a word of knowledge that God wanted to heal somebody's ear. And when he said that out loud, with Vinny there, when he said it out loud, at the moment he said it, Vinny's ear popped open where he could hear. And it scared Vinny so bad. Vinny was chewing gum, and Vinny swallowed his gum hold and almost choked. So what we saw was Vinny choking. We had no idea his ear had opened. And so he didn't even tell us right then, but later on through a series of events, Vinny said this. He said, at that moment, everything that I knew and everything that I was sure of in life, it changed in a moment, because something that he knew to be true, that he was deaf, was no longer true. So it just suddenly, in a moment, his whole world was rocked. And so Vinny was very open. And in fact, Vinny got baptized 2 weeks later. He received Jesus. And so that just is another, the power of God, then the truth of God, and those encounters work together. And then the final one I wanted to share is about several years ago, we were in Australia up at the Gold Coast, and we were there training believers to share the gospel and do the works of Christ. And later on, I get this report from a guy. He worked with a Muslim guy that he had on his heart. He'd been trying to share the gospel with, didn't really know what to do. He didn't know about discovery studies and all of those things. He just had a guy he worked with that God had put on his heart, and he wanted to see this guy come to faith in Christ. And I'll call that Muslim guy Jason, just for the sake of my story. And so he had tried to talk to Jason, but Jason, he would be friendly, but he would not engage in spiritual conversation. And he did not want to hear anything about Jesus or the Bible or the gospel. He was really not open to it. And so my friend, this guy that wrote me, said, I just was praying with him. Well, one day, this guy is passing Jason in the hallway at work, and Jason's walking down the hallway, and he notices he is limping really badly and he's in pain. And so he said, hey, Jason, what's up with your leg? And Jason said to him, hey, I was in my Taekwondo class. And see, Taekwondo. He was in his Taekwondo class. And while I was in Taekwondo class, this thing happened and I ended up injuring my leg. And he pulled his pants leg up, and he showed him his leg was really swollen. It was red, and he was in a lot of pain. And so my friend was looking at his leg, and he looks up at Jason and he says, hey, Jason, does your God heal? And Jason just like looked at him, and he said he had a really funny look. And he said, well, no, I don't think so. And my friend says, well, my God heals. And so he said, can I lay hands on you? And I don't know if he waited for a yes or not. And he just laid hands on him and prayed for him in the name of Jesus. And as soon as he did, the pain left. And Jason got freaked out. He's like, what'd you do, man? What'd you do? The pain's gone. And within moments, all the swelling had gone down, and it freaked Jason out. In fact, Jason ran back to his office, and he didn't see him the rest of the day. But the next day, Jason was really open. And later, within just a week or so, he was able to lead Jason into receiving Jesus. And he had been Muslim, but he was able to go through scriptures with him. Then he was open to the truth, and he was able to lead him into receiving the Lord. So you see how somebody was closed, but this power opened them, and then the truth could come in. And so that's what we see. We see the power brings a crowd. It gets people's attention. And then we see it also cuts through darkness, because I'm telling you, Islam can be darkness and just, atheism. These things can be darkness. And you might say, I got a book, but they got a book. And you might say, I got a book, and they'll say, well, that's an old book and it's totally irrelevant. But the power of God, that kind of just jumps in the middle of all that and interrupts that dark thinking. So now when Stan said this to me, we're back to Stan, all these thoughts just hit me. And I realized that, just as I've been thinking about it, that since I have come into disciple making and in this way and learning about movements and all, that we have definitely taken a truth approach. And honestly, we probably needed it. And I know we definitely needed all the things that we've learned about, discovery studies, finding people of peace, forming groups, having people come to Christ in groups, not just individuals. So there's been so many things that have been really corrective for us. So many things. And a lot of things we've learned about making disciples who make disciples, and that we have to emphasize truth, because that is the thing that's guaranteed. You can always pass truth on. You don't always control power, but you don't control power, but you definitely can pass truth on. But I also realized that at the same time, we've seen a whole lot less healings and miracles. And frankly, we just haven't seen that many. In fact, I was talking to someone else who's on this call, and they have kind of a similar story as we do. They came to Christ through a great deliverance in their own life and a great healing in their life. And they had a lot of miracles, and they've come into disciple making and they haven't had as many. And I think it's because we've been so focused on the truth and making sure we had that right. And we needed to, but here's the deal. What Stan was saying is we need truth and power, because they work together. So I'm back at that dinner. Now we're back in San Diego. We're at dinner. I've just asked Stan about this. He's, trying to convince me we need power. I'm like, yes, Stan, I'm getting it. And so I said, well, Stan, what do we need to do? What should we do if we need power and we don't have it? And so then he says this to me. He says, when a boxer has one arm that's stronger than the other, what does he do? Like, I know. But for some reason, I just said to him, well, obviously, he just ties the strong one behind his back. I actually was saying that to be funny. And he said, exactly. And I'm like, oh, okay. So if he's got two arms and one of them's a lot stronger than the other, when he ties the strong one back, which makes sense, then he's just got this one, he's got to defend himself. And that will cause that, he'll be highly motivated to defend himself. And it'll cause that arm to get stronger and to be strengthened. And so he said, so since you're out of balance in truth encounters, maybe you should purpose to only have power encounters. And maybe you should just say, for the next 6 months, all we're going to do is have power encounters. Maybe you got to tie your strong arm of truth behind your back and just have power encounters. And I'm just sitting there going, I don't think so. What does that even mean? What are you talking about? Stan, you are a crazy man. But anyway, I didn't say all that. I looked, oh yes, brother. But anyway, we sat there. We were there at least another hour talking about this stuff and how necessary it is that we have got to have healings and miracles for the gospel to break through into communities. And two, I was just remembering in the documentary Ordinary People, which if you haven't seen that, that's a really good documentary. It's on YouTube, Ordinary People. It's about disciple making. There's a story in there. There's a story in there about a woman who was healed. And I think was in Tanzania, and it was in an area where there was a lot of spiritual resistance, but a lot of people in that documentary went back to that when that point where that woman got healed, and that had an influence on them being open, them learning, them being curious, them coming. And so people knew her, they heard that story, just like in the Bible. And then many people have come to faith and become disciples who make disciples. And that woman's healing's been a key to the movement there. So I told you we were going to have a challenge and we need to end this. So here's the challenge. What is it that you're doing to have power encounters? And so it may be that you are way ahead of me and you are having them, left and right, so to speak. I don't know. What do we together, what do we need to do to strengthen our weak power arms? And do we need to tie our truth arm behind our back? I don't know. What would that even look like? I don't even know. So I'm kind of just presenting this as like, hey, this is what Stan said to me, and it's been bothering me for a month. So I thought maybe I should bother you with it. What is it that we need to do as a community, as a family of disciple makers? What do we need to do? Or what is the Lord saying to us? Because one thing I learned early on in disciple making is we need to do what the Lord tells us to do. And so what is the Lord telling you to do? So I've been praying about it. I just wanted to present it to y'all. I'll tell you this, I have 2 more weeks of coaching sessions. And so I think we're going to take both of those and just explore this topic a little more. I got some ideas of how we can do that. But meanwhile, here's the challenge. Why don't you pray? And praying is talking, but it's also listening. Why don't you pray? Why don't you go back and read these verses we read today? And here, why don't you go read John 14, 10 through 12? And let's see what, and just ask the Lord and any other verses he gives you and say, let's just see what he wants to do. Is there a place of correction for us? Is there something the Lord wants to do about power encounters that will really help us break through in some of our areas, the spiritual resistance, and start seeing more people reached and more people willing to hear the truth and have spiritual conversations?
Read John what?
John chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, just those verses from Jesus. Those are verses I've meditated on a lot. John chapter 14, verses 10 through 12, those. And then the final thing I'm going to say is this. And if you have any comments after today or anything you want to share with me or with the group as a whole, just send me a message or post it in Slack. I'm in Slack. You can send me a private message or you can post it in Slack and let's maybe have a conversation. Maybe you have experiences that I'm not having that you could share with us. I don't know. I'm just kind of, like I said, I'm opening this up for discussion and opening this up for how is God leading us? We're a community. It's not one person leading. It's not one person that's got the corner on the market. God is leading us all. And I know we all have different experiences, different gifts, different things that he's shown us. And so I'm just open to that.